and welcome to another episode of Captive Minds. My name is Shaenah Batterson, and I will be your host for today. I am a writer based in Eugene, Oregon, with a Substack page called The Red Letter, where I will repost my articles, but also publish poetry and more recently, experimental art video that I did. Anyways, my journalistic work is published in Covert Action magazine. And with me, as always, is my co-host, Max Parry. Hi, Max.
Yes, hello. We've also got my cat back here too. Sorry. But yeah, no, it's good to be here for another episode, and we got a good topic for today. So yeah.
Yeah, unfortunately, my cat isn't here right now. I wish he was, but and Max is an independent journalist located in Baltimore, and he is currently syndicated with Cam, so I suggest you go check out his work there. The topic for today is our attempt to answer the seemingly ever-present question, is Marx's analysis of capitalism still relevant? Especially since the fall of the Soviet Union, people across the political spectrum really have claimed that Marxism is no longer applicable to the modern world. One could say that the right-wing take is that neoliberal capitalism won the Cold War and constitutes the most advanced form of human social organization, meaning that we've reached the end of history, to paraphrase Francis Fukuyama. The quote-unquote left-wing take is that Marxism is too conservative, too totalizing, it ignores particularities, etc., and capitalism isn't at all like it used to be, so Marxism needs to be moved beyond or updated, post-Marxism, all this other stuff, post-modernism, etc. This dismissal of Marxism actually goes back much further than the Berlin Wall coming down. For example, in this out-of-print Progress Publishers book I happened upon at a local bookstore, printed in the USSR in 1974, it's titled The End of Ideology Theory, Illusions and Reality, Critical Notes on a Fashionable Bourgeois Conception by Lev Moskvichov, who was deputy head of the chair of Marxist-Leninist philosophy of the Academy of Social Sciences of the Central Committee of the CPSU.
Well, at least they listed his first name. I've noticed with a lot of I used to try and collect Progress Publishers books, and some of them I noticed they would just frequently just, or at least on the cover, just put like the initial and then the last name. And it's, of course, it's always a very, in the West, it's a very obscure figure. So always, but yeah, at least they got his full name on there.
And it's a quality print job, too. I mean, this book is sturdy. Anyways, in the book, the author points out how the end of ideology theory, which, states that ideology is no longer a driving factor in how they term it, advanced industrial society, making no distinction between whether it's a capitalist or a socialist society, originated from a 1955 Congress for Cultural Freedom event, which, for those of you who have not watched our other episodes where we talk extensively about the Congress for Cultural Freedom, it was a sort of psychological operation of the CIA where they funded this organization that brought together Western artists and intellectuals to create sort of a cultural front against communism. At this Congress for Cultural Freedom meeting, the topic of the end of ideology was sort of discussed, and with figures like is it Aaron Bell? Is that the right first name?
Not sure.
I get them mixed up. It's in this book, but anyhow, the author of this book points out how it is in and of itself a form of bourgeois ideology, and so it's even funnier if that he does go on later in the book to mention how the CCF is traced back to the CIA, so that really shows it actually kind of emanated from the U.S. national security state. But anyhow, because capitalism had changed due to internal class struggle and the threat of the Soviet Union as an example of a different way to structure society, bourgeois sociologists drew false conclusions from real trends, like trends such as the technological revolution and the welfare state, that capitalism was evolving in an egalitarian direction, and socialism can be solved with simple reform measures or social engineering. However, the author of this book traces the roots of the end of ideology theory back further to earlier sociologists' efforts to combat Marxism, in the guise of being objective and free from ideology, something which is ideological in and of itself,
Exactly.
as and a lot of them would still be openly anti-Marxist, and as Lenin said, quote, to belittle the socialist ideology in any way, to turn aside from it in the slightest degree, means to strengthen bourgeois ideology. It's being truly free from ideology is sort of a myth. That just means that you've adopted the dominant ideology in the society that you're living in, because only when you have an ideology that is opposed to the society that you're living in does it appear as an obvious ideology. Indeed, historically, the example of the Russian Revolution itself has actually been attempted to be used to refute Marx because, he predicted the revolution would first occur in Western Europe.
Hmm.
However, if one takes the view of Marxism as a science, which I know I do, it's not as some sort of magical prophecy that didn't come true.
Yeah, he
Um,
didn't have a crystal ball.
and now they will do. Anyways, uh, it's a method of analyzing the world. So the fact that the revolution occurred in Russia, not in Western Europe, doesn't refute Marxism. To quote from this End of Ideology book, quote, a feature of the contemporary bourgeois denigrators of scientific communism is that they above all play down or ignore the fact that Marxism-Leninism is an objective social science. They depict it as revolutionary teaching only as an ideological construction, basically similar to other ideological doctrines that have existed in history. Their critique of Marxism-Leninism is founded on a distortion of the basic principles of communist ideology, or ascribing to it features and characteristics which it never had. The type of criticism is far from being an objective sociological analysis. Close quote. And, as we can see, as with all other sciences, the method and the premises get improved upon as our knowledge grows, which is, I would argue, what Lenin did with Marxism in his book, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, where he updated Marx's analysis for the way capitalism had developed in his day. And, that's why, in my opinion, Marxism-Leninism, when properly understood, isn't dogmatic because it calls us to make a concrete analysis of the concrete situation, as Lenin said, to figure out what tactics and what strategy are the best path towards the goal of Marxism, which is ultimately a classless society. It's not scientific or effective to just apply the same rote steps to every case. Each revolutionary situation is unique. But, someone could play the devil's advocate and argue that the Frankfurt School were also attempting to bring Marxism up to date to what it was, and, to the current day with their addition of Freudianism and their analysis of consumer society, as they called it. Yet, I would argue that they abandoned the actual method itself of Marxism, which is dialectical historical materialism, and lapsed into idealist analysis. I think that was too much of the Freud influence. But Max, do you want to talk about how the Frankfurt School indirectly helped push forward the claim that more orthodox forms of Marxism are no longer applicable?
Well, I mean, depending on who you're talking about, I think it was it was more direct than indirect. But I think that the development of Western Marxism itself, like you could say, was indirect in that, like, where its genesis is or where its roots lie, which began with Lukács. But before I get into that, I mean, I think it's necessary just to state, because you mentioned the neoconservative thinker Francis Fukuyama. I mean, I think it's necessary to state the way in which Western Marxism negated Orthodox Marxism in rejecting like its economic determinism, its positivism, as a trait of the Enlightenment, and also like its prediction of inevitable revolution, like you mentioned in Western Europe, which in the case of like Germany and Hungary and England and so forth, it didn't come true. That's qualitatively different than the way in which like a conservative like Francis Fukuyama declared Marxism obsolete after the Soviet Union collapsed and Berlin Wall came down. The likes of Fukuyama is not really our primary concern today here for this discussion, I think. That's sort of more obvious why that's wrong. I mean, I think he himself has even admitted recently that his what he prophesied in that or prophesized in that book was is uh, is really dated, and it's certainly not the case. Marxism has definitely made a comeback, but also I think that the historical context is needed to understand how the Frankfurt School or Western Marxism, the Institute for Social Research in Germany, which began in Frankfurt and then eventually came stateside after the rise of the Nazis in World War II. And many of its figures became associated with, for a time, Columbia University, and then also people like Marcuse at the University of California. But I think what you're referring to refers more to Western Marxism generally, and I think most of it can be traced back at the conclusion of World War One. There was, for example, the failed German Revolution, and some of the members of the Frankfurt School actually participated in that, including Herbert Marcuse, who went on to become, the godfather of the new left, they call him, though he rejected that title mostly. But his involvement in that was also to a very limited degree. But it's interesting. I'm doing research for an article right now related to this subject in Marcuse, and Herbert Marcuse was one of those intellectuals he had taken part in the 1919 revolt in Germany, albeit to a limited degree. He was a member of a soldiers' council in Berlin. But, it's kind of strange because he never actually registered with the Communist Party of Germany, the KPD. He was actually a member still of the Social Democratic Party, which doesn't really make a lot of sense. It's very confusing because that was the very party that had, as we've discussed on previous podcasts, had betrayed the working class, voting for war credits. And they were actually the party, that was in power that put down the Spartacist uprising, by far left revolutionaries. And they did so in collaboration with the Free Corps, the proto-fascist paramilitaries. To be fair, Marcuse did leave the SPD once he realized their complicity in the deaths of his fellow revolutionaries, Rosa Luxemburg, Karl Liebknecht, and others who led the Spartacist uprising. But then, at the same time, he never joined the KPD afterwards, like Karl Korsch and other people. He was actually later confronted about that in detail, and he was, of course, he was very dismissive that it didn't matter and all this stuff. But it kind of speaks to how they always had Western Marxist thinkers like Marcuse always had very kind of unserious, uncommitted political practices. And I think also due to his, like many others, like Adorno and Horkheimer, his upper middle class background, he never really identified truly with the working class politics of the KPD. But anyway, Marcuse, nevertheless, he was part of a soldiers' council that took part in the abortive uprising. And meanwhile, in Hungary, Georgi Lukács, who was in Hungary at the time, concurrently, he joined the Hungarian Soviet Republic, which was the short-lived republic in 1919. I mean, unlike the Spartacist uprising, which was just extinguished very quickly, the Hungarian Revolution actually was briefly successful, and they did form a short-lived republic. And Lukács actually served as the People's Commissar for Education and Culture. and he was a deputy for, or I'm sorry, he was a commissar also for the Hungarian Red Army. And that republic, which was led by Bela Kun, collapsed. It lasted just 130 days, and then Lukács fled to Vienna, and then later ended up in Germany in the early 30s. But anyway, so after these two revolutions failed, a number of Marxists in Western Europe, like Lukács and Marcuse, were left to perform, an autopsy on why, the revolution had not transpired like it did in the USSR, which, as you were alluding to, the USSR was a mostly underdeveloped agrarian-based peasant society. It had a very small proletariat, relatively. There was industry, primarily centered in big cities like Moscow and St. Petersburg, but overall it was 80% peasants. And so the success of the Russian Revolution, coupled with the failure of the revolutions in West Germany, as Marx had predicted, he envisioned for the revolutions to happen in highly industrialized Western European nations, not culturally backwards, agrarian, agricultural based country like Russia. He assumed that capitalism had to be fully developed to produce a large class conscious proletariat that would develop class consciousness and be ready to seize the means of production, which Russia didn't really have at the time. Its population was mostly dominated by illiterate peasants, while its working class was relatively small. So this paradox presented the Marxist thinkers in the West with this predicament. Why did this happen? Why did Marx's predictions not come true? So Lukács proceeded to write History and Class Consciousness, which came out in 1923, and it's widely cited as one of the foundational texts of Western Marxism.
Although Lukács himself later denounced it.
Yeah, well, it's always said, you read the mainstream accounts like that he did that under pressure from the Comintern and Stalinism, but I think that's obviously a very biased take. I think he sincerely, his politics, he realized the mistake he made. He returned to a more classical Marxist perspective, and he saw, in that book, if you read it, he really does reject orthodox Marxism's, deterministic philosophical doctrine as sort of mechanically materialist, you might say. The idea that the economic conditions alone would produce revolutionary consciousness that would lead to the overthrow of capitalism. He disputed that and cited, the example of his native Hungary and also Germany as well as that being not true, and that he argued that Marx didn't account for, subjective human agency enough, and that the economic factors alone, can't be treated separately, and that Marx didn't account for how, as capitalism was developing, that thought itself was reified under capitalism, and that while yes, I mean, Lukács did not dispute that the proletariat was the revolutionary agent, like people like Marcuse, Adorno, and Horkheimer did later. But what he did say was that that the working class could not do so passively or just by economic fatalism. It wasn't the economic conditions alone that could produce the revolutionary consciousness. It was not automatically produced by economic conditions. He advocated that, if you read that book, that the proletariat had to consciously recognize its historical role to break through reification or objectification of capitalist society. And this is sort of where the cultural politics, I think, of Western Marxism really began. The emphasis on cultural politics and ideology. But like you were saying, Lukács himself did later renounce a lot of the book as idealist and Hegelian when he became more orthodox Marxist later on. And I think he saw how what he sort of began in that book led to the direction his peers later went in, which is also why he later denounced them, the Frankfurt School, as taking refuge in what he called the Grand Hotel Abyss, which that had as much to do with their political practices or lack thereof and their armchair intellectualism. But it also had to do with, their denial of their complete abandonment of the working class as revolutionary agent altogether. But looking back on his own work from a classical Marxist perspective, he saw that in History and Class Consciousness, he had placed too great of an emphasis on individual human consciousness and also spontaneous revolutionary action, and then downplayed too much, what Marx talked about, the objective structural laws of economics leading to revolutionary consciousness in the proletariat. But, I think you also have to consider one other really important factor here, besides the failed revolutions in Germany and Hungary. Because also around this time, I believe it was the early 30s, Marx's early writings were published, namely, not just the German ideology, but specifically the economic and philosophical manuscripts of 1844, both of which were not published in full until the early 30s. So up to that point, Marx's work, as it was publicly known, was more was more known for its structural economic analysis and emphasis on class struggle, not as much on ideology and reification. So that the release of those works, they always try and say that the Soviet Union really tried to suppress the publication of those works. That might be true to some degree. I'm not sure, but either way, they were released in 1932. And the young Marx, he had been a member of the Young Hegelians, and his work in his early work really does reflect that, in that there was less emphasis on structural economic analysis, and he was yet to formulate what he did in works like Capital, where he, prophesized the inevitable downfall of capitalism. The early Marx in those works was much more focused on alienation and humanism, how capitalism separates human beings from their, I forget what the German word is for it, but their species being, their essence, basically, as social and conscious producers. And, of course, through alienation, it robs them of their true freedom to freely create and produce for all of humanity's benefit. Instead, they're just working to reproduce their needs over and over again. And, his philosophy in those early works was still mostly idealistic and not materialist or as focused on the class struggle. I mean, it's always said that Marx took Hegel's philosophy and inverted it, took it from standing on its head and put it back on its feet. Well, I guess one might say that Lukács in History and Class Consciousness, or at least this is how he put it back on its head, basically. He reversed the framework, and once again was almost looking at Marxism through a Hegelian lens by focusing on the alienation and reification, and also Hegel's idea. I mean, I'm not really super well versed in Hegel, admittedly. It's very difficult. But his idea of a world spirit, I understand, was very similar to how Lukács, in his revisionism, characterized the proletariat in this like messianic way, like as the subject object of history. And again, like it's always said in mainstream accounts that Lukács renounced his earlier work under pressure from, because he was living in the East, that he was doing that he only rejected his earlier work to appease, the authorities. But I think that's again, it's just demonization of communism. He realized the mistake he'd made, and also seeing the direction that Western Marxism ended up going with Adorno and Horkheimer and co. But it's in hindsight, it's understandable. Like I said, given the historical circumstances in which he wrote that book, and he was far from the only one too. Another example was Antonio Gramsci. If you read Gramsci, he also, to an extent, rejected strict economic determinism. his idea of cultural hegemony to account for why workers in the industrialized West had not risen up in revolution. I think there's a lot of similarities between his idea of cultural hegemony and what Adorno and Horkheimer wrote about in dialectic enlightenment in the culture industry. Both try and explain how the ruling class or capitalist society maintains its control by shaping mass consciousness and through ideology. I do think that there are key differences, though, in that Gramsci focused on how ideological consensus is established through institutions, while Adorno and Horkheimer argued, not just in terms of fusing with Freudianism, but also that the culture industry did so by, standardizing popular culture to create a docile, passive consumer society. So there is a key difference there. I don't think that Gramsci had the same pessimism about human nature, which really, in Adorno and Horkheimer, I think that's clearly the influence of Freud. But there is some overlap. And also, obviously, Gramsci was very, very different in his political practices. He was highly active politically as a member of the Italian Communist Party. And of course, he was imprisoned by the Italian fascist regime and died in prison, while Adorno and Horkheimer, really shunned praxis altogether, even in the face of the rise of fascism, and fled Europe to the United States. I don't think that they ever claimed to reject Marxism altogether, but like I said, they synthesized it with Freudian psychoanalysis and, arguably sort of hollowed it out. They removed the very thing that makes Marxism Marxism. And they did so on the basis that Marx had failed to accurately predict the revolutionary situation in Europe as it transpired. Like I was saying, as though he ever had, there's this, I mean, I think people were caught up in the times, but like there is this idea that like Marx like had like a crystal ball or like was like clairvoyant or something. He never claimed to, he simply argued that the economic laws, that the contradictions of the inherent contradictions of capitalism would eventually lead to its own overthrow.
Do
That
you,
doesn't mean that it won't in the meantime like make adjustments or like with Keynesian economics, like the reforms that are, like in the West, like we're talking about, like keep the population just enough, like, just at a standard living enough to where they won't revolt. And yes, you could argue that, of course, that something like the advent of consumer society certainly keeps people distracted and docile and passive. But I think the problem with something like what Adorno and Horkheimer were saying was that they, made these conclusions about human nature, and also just to suggest that because of that therefore means that the proletariat is no longer the revolutionary agent of history, I think is
well, I think
a
that's,
whole other thing entirely.
well, I think that's what's, you know, if you take the argument or like, what you're saying about Gramsci and the Frankfurt School about the control, the ruling class's control and of ideology, then the logical answer of that would be to try to promote and organize a proletarian ideology and counteract the state ideological apparatus, as Althusser
Yeah, I
called
mean,
it. Not
how
just go,
they
we just give up.
yeah, I mean to his credit, Marcuse rejected that. I mean, he was at odds with the complete abandonment of praxis altogether, especially by Adorno and Horkheimer. I mean, who just had absolute contempt for it. And also the idea that Marx didn't account for Freud's discoveries, because I mean, they didn't just adopt Freud's ideas. I mean, I think that they were very much more in line with Freud than Marx in terms of how they viewed human nature very pessimistically, and that not only were the working class rendered too passive by consumerism and the dominant ideology, but like too culturally backwards and reactionary. And but like Marcuse, this is why someone like Marcuse later put his faith, as far as revolutionary potential goes, in marginalized groups, racial minorities, sexual minorities, and actually even the even the unemployed and the lumpen proletariat over workers as catalysts for social transformation. I mean, this is a big deviation from Marx because, I mean, trying to tell somebody like this today, the Western left, especially today, really, I think, arguably romanticizes, the lumpen proletariat, the homeless, to this very naive degree. I mean, Marx was pretty clear that he considered them a parasitic class and social scum. But I think this is why someone like Marcuse ended up being such an influential figure on the New Left. Because if you read works like Essay in Liberation, he saw, which came out in '69, he saw potential in the most oppressed and underprivileged groups as forces of revolutionary change over the proletariat. And also in when I did research for my article on David Horowitz, which talked a lot about Ramparts magazine. Ramparts in 1970, they published Marcuse's essay, The End of Utopia. And that was like the flagship publication of the New Left. So while they didn't declare Marx no longer applicable, they certainly revised it to such a degree that its most important elements were discarded. And it was turned, as in the case of Adorno and Horkheimer, it was basically just turned into a lens by which to view or analyze and critique culture.
Well, and I would argue, like with Marcuse, placing revolutionary potential instead on minorities and marginalized groups and all that, is that that's not, following a materialist analysis, because the whole reason that the proletariat is the revolutionary class is because they possess the ability to seize the means of production, something which, a homeless person or a gay person or whatnot might not be able in the position to do.
Well, and also university students.
Right.
Marcuse really, students were also the vanguard of the New Left. And that was another area where he was at odds with Adorno and Horkheimer. And actually, it's interesting. Like I said, I'm doing a lot of research on the Frankfurt School for an article I'm working on. It's so funny because most people who are very critical, like we are, of the Frankfurt School and Western Marxism, one of the most widely cited incidents to sort of like discredit or really that really tainted the legacy of someone like Theodore Adorno was a specific incident that happened in January of 1969 when he famously called the police on a group of student demonstrators that were occupying, believe it was a seminar room or auditorium at the Institute for Social Research in Germany. And this situation had come to a head. He'd been the target of many different disruptions by the West German student movement. And obviously, that's no matter any way you slice it, whatever anyone wants to say about the nature of these students and their political activities, their amateurishness, or what, Adorno, like I do think there's some validity to Adorno's arguments about revolutionary actionism as far as like so much of the left just being motivated purely by action, as Lenin said, without revolutionary theory, there can be no revolutionary movement. So if a movement is just focusing purely on action without theory, it is pretty bankrupt. So, but whatever anyone wants to say about that, I think everyone can agree that his decision, even Marcuse really ripped into him for siding with the university. I mean, the West German government, to call the police on these students. But less discussed, this incident is widely cited, but less discussed is actually the reasons why these students were protesting in the first place. And I did a lot of research about that. And the reason that what catalyzed this West German student movement, which was part of a wave of student protests happening in Europe, in France in 68, most famously. Also, it even spread to the Eastern Bloc, the Prague Spring. But specifically in Germany, if you look at what catalyzed that student movement, it happened 2 years earlier in 1967. And in Germany in 1967, there was a demonstration in Germany against a state visit by the Shah of Iran, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. And during a demonstration against the state visit by the Shah, the police gunned down a student. His name was Benno Onesorg, and he was shot and killed by a policeman during a protest against a state visit by the Shah of Iran. And this is in 1967. Not long after, another group of students, this is 2 years before the police incident, another group of students, they disrupted a lecture by Adorno, or they were protesting outside a lecture hall, I think, where he was going, and he just went right past them. And basically, these protesters, they were asking for his solidarity, or really rather demanding his solidarity with them. And he refused. He called them Stalinists, and that their tactics were unacceptable. So he didn't, call the popo or sick the pigs on them in that incident, but he disparaged them, but accused the movement of Stalinism. The following year, a far-right fascist tried to assassinate the leader of the German SDS, whose name was Rudi Dutschke, if I'm saying it. And so anyway, he still wouldn't pledge any allegiance with them. And then eventually the tensions came to a head between the critical theorist and the activists in January 69, and that's what led to the incident. So anyway, my main point is reading about this, it's no wonder that the Western left is so fucking terrible on Iran. Here's this guy, he's not, I mean, the Shah was a Western puppet. He had taken power, retaken power after the CIA-backed coup of Mossadegh. And, of course, the absurd thing about him calling these protesters the students Stalinists, is that they were the furthest thing from Stalinists. I mean, these were new left hippie act. I mean, there was one incident where they disrupted his classroom, where these women threw flowers at him and pulled up their top to show their
Oh
tits.
my God.
So, I mean, for him to call these people, call them Stalinists is just, of course, completely absurd. But it's really, he had contempt for, I mean, regardless of what anyone wants to say about those protesters, they were not wrong about protesting a state visit by the fucking Shah, or asking for his solidarity against the West German government, which was full of Nazis. So anyway, yeah, just to get back to, I just wanted to mention that as an incredible story, because in the context of what's happening now, it's no wonder the Western left has been so bad on something like Iran.
Yeah, I had not read about that incident before. I'm glad you dug that up.
Yeah, I mean, I knew about the police incident, and I knew that they were criticizing his praxis. I didn't know about the incident that specifically catalyzed the whole student movement to begin with.
Yeah, that's
We should we should get back to the question that you asked. I think that basically a thread can be drawn, the shifting of Marxism from class analysis, towards the psyche, towards culture and ideology, to say subsequent movements, like, for example, post-structuralism. You can certainly see how Adorno and Horkheimer, their writings about an administered society and rationalization, how that impacted someone like, say, Michel Foucault, or the critiques in post-structuralism of power, and also the rejection of postmodernism, for example, of grand narratives, Marxism as a grand narrative. Similarly, someone like Foucault and his whole idea of biopolitics, the idea about the state controlling every aspect of you know, it's difficult to explain, but yeah, like the state's power to manage populations through like this technology of power, regulating every aspect of life. You can see how that later led to, like, for example, like what they call post-Marxism. People like the duo Antonio Hart and Michael Negri, who wrote a very influential book called Empire. That had a
And it's not what you think it is from the title for those who
no,
haven't read it.
no. I mean, it's a very misleading title, and it's a very problematic book for a number of reasons. But nevertheless, it was very, very influential because I think it came out in the late 80s, early 90s, maybe mid 90s. But Empire basically reinterprets global politics and imperialism, with the advent of globalization. Again, it's this idea that because Marx didn't anticipate globalization, or the details of it anyway,
Well,
uh,
because I would argue that he did interpret and did, forecast globalization and that, you know, capitalism by its very nature must expand across the whole globe. He definitely predicted that, I would say, but
yeah, I think I mean, but their book does proceed from the premise that that global capitalism is reached such a scale that it's radically different. There's too much of a gap between the time when Marx was writing and the situation now. And when they say empire, they're talking about late capitalism has, instead of like individual nation states, like imperialist countries dominating the planet, it's now this totally decentralized form of sovereignty on a global scale. And instead of nation states and traditional class conflict, you have, like in classical Marxism, you have now in globalized capitalism, according to Hart and Negri, there's no territorial center or one state in charge, but rather big global financial institutions like the World Trade Organization, the WTO, or the International Monetary Fund, or the World Bank. This book was extremely influential, directly or not, on, like the anti-globalization movement of the 90s, which of course peaked during the anti-WTO protests in Seattle in 1999, the Battle of Seattle. And, Hart and Negri, if you read that book, they argue that imperialism has transitioned. The imperialism that Lenin or Marx wrote about was inapplicable to today's world amid globalization. And, um, while some of the details, while some of the things they point out are certainly valid, you can see how a book like that really, their whole academic, postmodernist, post-Marxist, biopolitical theory, it really ultimately serves imperialism because it's obfuscating the very material reality by suggesting that imperialism is outdated, and moving away from the classical Marxist understanding of the capitalist mode of production. And it's also, in my opinion, the biggest problem with it is that it's a denial of how imperialist exploitation on a global scale. I'm sorry, like even in the case of institutions like the IMF, the World Bank, those are U.S. dominated institutions. They're very much US led. It's not decentralized at all. Yes, I mean you could say with like multinational corporations, like however much they adhere to individual nation states. I mean, we all know where they're housed in the West. Like if they're going out and they're dominating third world countries. Yeah, you could say that the lines have been blurred a lot, but this idea that we need to reinvent the wheel here, this is really obfuscating the material basis of class struggle, and also, again, like how much the US really, imperialist exploitation is very much led by an American empire. I mean, that's really what the fucking title of that book should be. This idea that global capitalism has totally reinvented itself, or that because, like, I mean, this is the general thinking among the Western left now, if you talk to Western leftists. This idea that because, oh, we have, like, for example, in this country, we have information age jobs, not factory workers. The US deindustrialized, all that's been shipped overseas. That means that Marx is somehow obsolete.
I,
This is really reactionary in my view.
yeah, I agree. And, I'd say if we examine contemporary society, stripped of all its appellations like digitalization, AI, crypto, and all that, Marx's analysis is still applicable if we boil it down. And in fact, Marx and Engels both wrote about how they thought capitalism is centrifugal. I don't think I'm pronouncing that right. Anyways,
Yeah.
in nature and would evolve to be increasingly monopolistic. Something Lenin really carried forward in his analysis of the bank's concentration of power and wealth. And yes, as you were pointing out, they are Western, generally Western dominated institutions and oftentimes even connected to the US security state with some of them. Marx's analysis of capitalism in a nutshell is that there is a class who owns the means of production, which we all rely upon to survive, and a class who has nothing to sell but its labor power, and that the owning class, the bourgeoisie, gains its wealth from exploiting the working class. So, it doesn't really matter then where the people that have nothing to sell but their labor power, whether they work in a factory or a, a grocery store, because it's still that fundamental class division. And, regardless of automation, the quote middle class, who usually don't own any means of production, when people speak of middle class in terms of income, because there is the petty bourgeoisie where you own like small business owners and all that. But by middle class, I mean people who make more income than a lower class person, but they don't own any means of production. So that's still true for them too. They still have nothing to sell but their labor power, even though they're making a decent amount of money. And as well, wealth is certainly more concentrated than ever. It hasn't, even though the living standard of the working class in the imperial core is certainly higher than many other places, the gap between your average person, say in the United States, and someone like Elon Musk is enormous. Let alone, on a global scale, the gap between some poorer person in another country and Elon Musk.
Yeah, no, I think that's certainly the case. I mean, it reminds me of like a lot of debates there have been about like, because like a lot of the jobs, like in the United States, for example, like a lot of the service jobs, like there have been debates about like whether certain kinds like baristas constitute workers per se, like or like the professional managerial class type jobs. There have been a lot of debates in the US left specifically, about and people making different arguments but again, like at the end of the day, regardless of any of that, like none of that I don't think renders Marx obsolete. And as far as like Hart and Negri go, and their pervasive thinking, I mean, I think they're really emblematic of a trend in academia that favors revisions of Marxism. Gabriel Rockhill has been very good about writing about this topic. And I think that that really began with Western Marxism in the Frankfurt School. And, this trend, it might appear critical of capitalism on the surface, but ultimately it's very compatible and safe in professional academia. I mean, someone like Zizek takes Hart and Negri's theories and just runs with them to this absurd degree with some of the stuff he says. And in fact, if you read Empire, Hart and Negri don't even advocate a class-based abolition of private property to fight globalization. They actually embrace it as laying the groundwork for a new democratic way of life. Uh,
Really?
yes, if you read their book, they talk about what they call the multitude. And the multitude is like, the way I understand it anyway, is that instead of, I mean, they characterize like the idea of the working class or the masses being, or the proletariat being, it's too homogenous. It doesn't apply to today's world. So therefore, the revolutionary agent today is what they call the multitude, meaning a collection of individuals around the globe who act together to resist globalization or empire using its tools against it. I mean, like, for example, the internet. I mean, when this book came out, the internet was really just taking off, and their ideas had a big, influence on stuff like digital culture jamming and hacktivism and all this stuff that was very popular, and still is influential today, really, in the sense that, I mean, they call it the multitude because it's a collection of individuals around the world who are connected through something like the internet, but they're different, but their differences are celebrated. Or the idea is that the multitude will use things like the internet or digital tools to regain public control over what's been privatized, like such as the means of communication. So, in other words, the solution is, this is another big problem with their whole thing, is that apart from replacing the working class with this very nebulous idea of the multitude, but their solution is basically change has to come from within. It's not going to come from outside. It's not to destroy the structures of empire, but to just reappropriate them.
Well,
It's basically like reclaiming the commons, to convert privatized spaces into collective ones, and so on. And you can see how this had a very big impact on the activist left in the U.S. and the anti-globalization movement and like contemporary anarchist thought. Obviously,
well,
this kind of thing is very easily absorbed by the very thing it seeks to challenge. I mean, and I think
well,
the reason, go ahead.
oh, I was just gonna say, if you examine the history of the internet itself, as Yasha Levine really does a good job of laying out in his book, Surveillance Valley, The Military History of the Internet, it actually has anti-communist origins, with uh, designed to combat the Viet Cong and be as a way to collect all the data coming in the Vietnam War. They needed some sort of centralizing system that could sort all the stuff out. But it was kind of given a counter, the internet was kind of given a countercultural rebrand, like with the whole Earth catalog. You can even see like with I think it was in 1984, Apple's ad for computers is like, don't be evil. And it's about like individual rebellion, and that's this sort of
Yeah,
democratic thing. But well, in reality, the internet has been historically deeply connected to the military and intelligence agencies.
yeah, we did a whole episode on that, and this is also a great opportunity. You know, I wish we had seen it before we did that episode, but we've subsequently watched that documentary, this German documentary called The Net,
I
which
was just gonna bring that up, so I'm
yeah,
glad you did.
we'll provide a link to that because it's available for free on YouTube, and it really is an excellent documentary that talks about how the internet, like, its connection to the 60s counterculture and how it's subsequently gone on to be used for so much of what's happening today in terms of social engineering and
And
yeah.
what I was going to mention about this documentary is in it, it was mentioned how Horkheimer and Adorno's F-scale test was seemingly used by the US state for social engineering purposes.
Yeah,
And
yeah. And that study, the authoritarian personality study that they did, speaking of the research that I mentioned earlier about all the research I'm doing for this article I'm working on, well, the F scale study, which was, this personality test done to determine the susceptibility or personality traits that lead someone to be prone to what they call an authoritarian personality or support for something like fascism. That study was actually done, it was based on an earlier study that had been done by a different Frankfurt School thinker. I believe it was Eric Fromm. And this study, this was done this was done during Weimar Germany. The Nazis hadn't even taken power yet. And it was, determining, basically it recognized that a lot of German workers, they were either members of the Communist Party or the Social Democratic Party. So they already had left leanings. but this study was judging them on all these this criteria that was these questions that really, I mean, it would determine anybody would be prone to something like authoritarianism. I mean, it's the criteria was just utterly ridiculous. And but Fromm's version of the study at least, did recognize that they had left leanings and that it was basically to determine what their revolutionary potential. But by the time you get to the F scale study that Adorno did, with, I believe it was with Nevitt Sanford from the what's that British institution, the Tavistock Institute. It abandoned the whole revolutionary potential of them altogether. It was just determining to what degree they were authoritarian and susceptible to fascism. So there was a trajectory here between this, but you can see how reactionary it was. And these people, instead of joining either the KPD or even the SPD to prevent the rise of fascism, on the cusp of Nazi Germany, on the cusp of Hitler taking power, they're doing tests on German workers on left-leaning German workers to determine whether whether they had revolutionary potential or instead would go over to fascism. I mean, it's just, yeah. So anyway,
Yeah, that I want to just briefly digress a little bit to talk about technocracy and fascism because, people increasingly with increasing surveillance, talk about how society is moving towards technocracy or even techno-feudalism, although I'd argue that technocracy and techno-feudalism are obfuscatory terms for the way in which capitalism morphs to preserve itself, actually to oftentimes, technocratic measures whereby I mean like social engineering and rule of experts is, undertaken to preserve capitalist society. And that was actually discussed a little bit in this book. To quote from it again, quote, measures within the bounds of social engineering are pursued in accordance with the vital interests of the ruling classes, while the working people, those who are at the center of the problem, demand that they should be implemented in their own interests. The end of ideology spokesman, by which he means like the CCF sort of theorists he was talking about, um, scientifically justify the incompetence of the masses in resolving social problems, advocate monopoly by the government and scientific authorities, and reveal very clearly their ideological credo: social engineering must serve the interests of the power elite. But social engineering logical potential cannot cure bourgeois society of its malignant disease. It cannot resolve the major contradictions of the society, even the specific problems for whose resolution the various social programs are intended cannot be resolved. Close quote. And that's sort of the essence of what people see as being technocratic of the monopoly of the government, scientific authorities, and these social engineering measures. But it's really because capitalism isn't inherently full of contradictions and unstable. So every now and then it requires these state interventions to rejuvenate itself. And that's where, like anarcho-capitalism is it would, if there was no state at all, capitalism would just implode much quicker.
well, yeah, and then most of them are environmentalists at the same time, and to address those concerns that would require the state to begin with. So that's also sort of contradictory. I think you were pointing that out on a previous episode. But speaking of those contradictions of capitalism, I mean, I was just going to say my final thing I had to say about Art Negri was that the big problem with their whole proposed solution really is that it leaves in place the contradictions of capitalism by saying that change can only come from within and not from the outside, that it can only come from within the current system by using the technologies that are within it. It's not about abolishing an actual property relation. So, and I think that that's sort of, the trajectory that can be traced back. And then the left is just constantly coming up with new ways to try and reinvent Marxism or rethink
Mm,
Marx, you know, and that's the situation we're still stuck in. It does
that's
seem like things are changing a little bit as far as like, returning to or a return to classical Marxism, but it's been a very slow process, especially when things are dominated by by people like by postmodernists like Hart and Negri.
yes, definitely. And speaking of libertarians, though, um, this morning I was reading Domenico Lacerda's really excellent book, Democracy or Bonapartism, Two Centuries of War on Democracy. And he was talking about the Austrian economist who a lot of libertarians really like, Ludwig von Mises. Um,
Yeah, the Mises Institute, it's the
so,
big
but
libertarian think tank. Yeah.
because we were talking about, people oftentimes misuse the term fascism, but I would say that I like Georgy Dimitrov's definition of fascism as the complete dominance of finance capital. And also, like what Fanon said about it being colonialism brought home to the imperial core, but basically, a method of saving capitalism from itself, so to speak. But interestingly, so writing at the time of Mussolini's dictatorship in Italy, Mises polemicized against legal regulation of working hours and other statist measures in Austria, but yet then he praised fascism for saving European civilization because, and here's the important part, in his perspective, fascism was a momentary remedy dictated by the emergency situation, meaning the threat of democratic gains made by the proletariat and hoped it could be used temporarily, with the goal of restoring liberalism and the market economy. And, that's actually, even though I don't agree with the Mises, that analysis, though, that is how the ruling class uses fascism.
Well,
I mean,
yeah, because
except he was advocating it instead of opposing it. But
libertarians, they think, or at least many of them, they think that what we have now is like the capitalism that Adam Smith and David Ricardo, wrote about, which obviously was progressive compared to feudalism, that they didn't anticipate, multinational corporations or, I mean, libertarians want a completely unregulated capitalism. They don't want the Federal Reserve and all that stuff. They think that what we have is a impure form of capitalism. I mean, it's a completely naive way of thinking.
well, that's why it's funny that even Mises, this like god for libertarians, was arguing that like sort of regulation of fascism was necessary to stave basically off the threat of like proletarian revolution or other gains.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know much about Mises, but I can't really say I'm surprised to hear that there is kind of a crypto fascist element to a lot of libertarianism. It is very paradoxical though, because like I think a lot of libertarians are politically, well intentioned. I mean, in that so many of them are like, for example, very passionately anti-war. But of course, they're very politically confused because it's like they don't understand that the drive, the drive for imperialist war and profit is so much an inherent part of capitalism,
Capitalism.
and it would be even worse without any regulation at all. I mean, it's a very, very, very politically confused way of misunderstanding the free market and the way it really works. I mean, but yeah, I mean, I didn't know very much about Mises, but I'm not really surprised to hear that. We should probably be wrapping up though. I think, do you have any final thoughts? I think we did a pretty good job. And this is such a big topic. I mean, we could have done a whole episode focused on the way in which conservatives, think Marxism is completely obsolete. But we wanted to focus more on the way the left has kind of evacuated Marxism of its, you know, its most important aspects, and you
Well,
know,
that's
reduced it to this other thing entirely. And
well,
yeah,
that's where I think, the libertarians say that it's like not capitalism anymore because there's state intervention, but that's where the Marxist definition of capitalism isn't about there being a market or not. It's about the fundamental class relation, between the owners of the means of production and the people who work and whose labor is exploited by the owners of the means of production. So, it's situated inside of, well, it's a mode of production. It's not, which is situated differently than the side of the market, which tends to obfuscate the relations of production.
yeah, that's a complex question, but yeah, no, I mean that's a very succinct way of putting it. Yeah, we hope you enjoyed this episode, and please remember to like and leave us comments. If you're watching us on YouTube, we have a Substack page. It's shaenahbatterson.substack.com. If watching us on Substack, we have a YouTube channel. It's Captive Minds Pod. We also have an X page, Captive Minds X. Again, both of our work is featured in Covert Action magazine, so you can see our writing there. And Shaenah also has a Substack page called The Red Letter. We will be back for another episode on another big topic sooner than later. Thank you for tuning in and watching and listening to Captive Minds. Thank you.
Thank you.